Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the Catholic faith that has come down over 2,000 years from Jesus and the apostles. We here at Catholic Truth want to help you to know your faith, love your faith, and live your faith with purpose and passion to be set on fire for and even be able to defend it. Sometimes on this show, we have different guests who are experts in their field or who have conversion stories or who have written a book. And today we have a guest who has written several books, and we have had him on here a couple of times. His name is Rod Bennett. And Rod is an author of several books, including These 12, which we did an interview with him on. The Apostasy That Wasn't, which was a great interview, and I will link that because I think people should watch it. It shows that Constantine didn't start the Catholic Church. He didn't really have influence in the Catholic Church, and it debunks a lot of the myths that surround the 4th century and the supposed invention of Roman Catholicism. And he has also written a book called Bad Bishops. And this book is the book that we are going to be talking about today. And I am going to share my screen just so you guys can see the title of it. And as you can see, it says Bad Shepherds, the Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived While the Bishops Did the Devil's Work. Now, if that's not an intriguing title, I don't know what is, but it's a great book. I've read it and it's fantastic. And it talks about some of the problematic times in the church where the church went through difficult times, including the clergy and especially the clergy. And I mean, many people today think that this is the first crisis we've ever faced, the first challenge we've ever had. Oh, this is the worst time the church has ever seen. But if you study church history, there are some very dark times in church history, and we're going to be talking about one of those times today. We're just covering one chapter. Maybe in the future we can cover some other chapters because all of them are good. But before we do that, I just want to welcome you to the show and welcome you back.
Thanks, Bryan. It's good to be here again.
Yeah, and it's great to have you back again. So many people think this is the first crisis that the church has ever faced, or the worst one by far we've ever faced. And I don't think many people know church history that well, which is why it's important to sometimes go back. And even when I talk to Protestants, I know you're a Protestant convert from evangelicalism, and you converted to the Catholic faith, even despite the problems, and I know many Protestants have, I guess I don't want to use the word yell, but they're forceful with me. Like, you Catholics think you're perfect. You think the church is perfect. You think you can't admit that you have any problems. I'm like, no, we've had several problems. The church has sinners in it. Jesus said there were going to be bad people all the way up into the hierarchy. So we have no problem admitting that, but it's still Christ's church and he still gets us through, right?
Right. Well, that's really was my main motivation for writing the book. I would often run into people who thought, oh, surely the end is here. Things have never been as bad as they are now. This is surely the end times. The return of Christ is any day now. I would be the very last person to teach anyone not to expect the return of Christ any day. It's an article of the Catholic faith that the return of Christ is imminent. That is, there's nothing preventing it from happening. It could happen at any day. We await it not with fear, but with joy. One of the last prayers offered in the Bible is Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. We're waiting for you to come back. We're not clinging to this world. You taught us to hold on lightly to this world and keep our eyes focused on you. So we're expecting that. But at the same time, if this is the last day, the end times, all the rest of it, it's not because things have never been worse. The reason I wrote the story was to give people some encouragement to know that we have had crises all along. And in other words, I think there was a movie recently called Our Brand is Crisis. I think our Catholic brand is crisis. The more you know about church history, the more you know that it's been one battle, one piece of warfare after another. Sometimes even the combatants, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, isn't very clear. But we've had enormous crises, and this, many with an enormous body count to go along with it. So far, the crisis of modernists in the church has not produced heaps of corpses, and the many of these previous crises did, of our own bad shepherds turncoats and compromisers and quislings within the Catholic Church have produced calamity, disaster on a scale that really most people don't have any idea of. So, and the reason the book was written, even though it's really one horror story after another, is because so that you won't feel like that something uniquely abnormal is happening. You know, it's been many of these, one after another, and to have that historical perspective shouldn't make us complacent, and I don't think it will, but it does tend to give us the historical perspective so that we won't believe that we're being singled out, or that there's everything's falling down around their ears. It'll teach us maybe to see the bucket as half full, which it certainly is, always is.
Yeah, some of them are very scary, some of these dark times, and especially, from priests and religious, and many, I'll come back to that in a second. But one of the things I like in the book is that, it's not all bad. There were very dark times, hellish times, but not all the people in the church were bad. There were many heroes. There were many good people. There were many people still fighting for the faith, despite the fact that others chose to compromise. It's never been a full sail, complete apostasy. Christ always guides his church nonetheless. And one thing that it's not just Protestants. I find a lot of traditional Catholics get very scared at the state of the church, understandably, today, and not, maybe traditionalists would be a better way to put it, to the fact that they go to an extreme in attacking the church, and they think this is the worst time, and it's like Armageddon, and we got to fight it, to a point where sometimes they leave the church to fight the church, and it's a problematic state. And I don't think they realize how dark times have been in the past. And by the same logic, if the church is bad now and the church is evil now, and we look at the fruits of their church now, then the church has never been good, if we're going to use that logic. Because what we're going to be talking about today alone, just today, is the Arian crisis. And that was one of the deepest, darkest, worst times in the church, where more traitors than ever came into the church. It started good. They held out for a little while, and then all hell broke loose.
Well, the Arian crisis took place in the early church. In other words, we tend to use that phrase as the early church as a kind of a golden age, but the Arian crisis, the greatest theological crisis the church ever had, yes, greater than the problem of modernism today, is the Arian crisis, and it happened in the 300s AD, still within the period of the early church fathers within the early church. So that puts a perspective on it. There's
why don't we
really
talk about
golden
it?
Age.
Yeah, no, yeah.
In one way, it's all the golden age. Grace and miracles have always abounded.
Yeah, for a short time, and then...
But Judases have always abounded too, even as they did when Christ was on earth among us.
And people might not be familiar, or they might have a vague familiarity with this. Yeah, the Arian crisis, they attacked the church, the divinity of Christ, the Council of Nicaea, saved the day. But that's when all hell broke loose, after the Council of Nicaea. See, they think, well, look at Vatican II, look at the fruits, all the bad things that blew up after Vatican II shows that the council was evil. Well, how much more did it do so after the Council of Nicaea, one of the greatest councils of all time, where clarified the divinity of Christ and so on. So maybe we can give people, maybe you could talk about the Arian crisis. Where did it come from? How did it start? And how did it really get bad to the point where even good bishops were turning against their own bishops?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I will take just a moment to say something to those Protestant lurkers that you mentioned.
Sure.
Before we get started on this, because you really have to be careful not to give a false impression here.
Correct.
I want to bring to mind to our evangelical or other Protestant friends a fact that they know from their very laudable study of the scriptures, and that is that God himself in the Old Testament allowed and put his stamp upon the kings of Israel, the institution of Israelite monarchy. And it wasn't his perfect will for them, but he allowed it. And once it was allowed, he put his stamp on it. He helped choose the kings, and superintended the process and had them ordained by Nathan the prophet to begin with, and all the rest of it. A neglected fact, but again, one that I think any of our evangelical friends who know this story will remember, is that of the 39, I believe, kings of Israel, beginning with David, who ruled over Israel, I think 3 of them were good. Maybe 1 was middling, and the rest of them were spectacularly evil. I mean, child sacrifice, idols on the altar in the temple next to the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, and raised civil war against other aspects of the. I mean, these guys were horrible. Manasseh was one of the worst. I mean, we had a long list of really spectacularly bad kings, worse than any pope. And there have been some bad popes, but these guys were worse than anything like that. And the batting average for Israel's monarchy is very low. If you had a player on your team that had this low of a batting average, you'd send him down to minor leagues. But there's absolutely no question that God's stamp was on the institution of the monarchy, that this was his doing, that he created it. Okay. And therefore, if bad kings, let's say that if bad popes and bad shepherds prove that the Catholic Church is not of God, then Manasseh and all the other terrible kings of Israel proved that the Davidic monarchy was not of God. But we know, all of us, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, that monarchy is of God, because David's throne is the one that Christ sits on. He will take the throne of his father David. The prophecies were all about reviving the kingdom of God that began in embryonic form with King David. So there's an important argument to get your mind around if you're considering these things. Scandal and tragedy and murder and horrors within the church parallel the scandal and horror and murder and the rest of it within the kings of Israel. And yet we know that throne, tainted as it was by the presence of these monsters that sat on it, is the throne of Christ. King Jesus will take that tainted throne himself. And there's a profundity to this, but there's also something encouraging in it. In other words, these kinds of apostasies and fallings away and all the rest of it don't mean that the thing itself is essentially bad. It has not been proven bad by the weakness and folly of some of the men who have sat on that throne.
And I would just add that not only that, which are fantastic points, but God himself led Israel even through those really dark, evil times. He chastised them a lot, but he protected the truth. He never let the truth go awry. Despite bad people leading Israel, the truth stayed intact, and God always kept that truth intact and brought it back if it was going astray. And Christ promised to do the same thing with his Holy Spirit in the church, despite the fact he even said that the gates of hell wouldn't prevail, meaning they're going to attack the church from without and from within, but he's still going to guide the church into all truth.
Absolutely. There's complete continuity on this point between the pre-Christian church, that is the Hebrew synagogue, and the church after the incarnation. It's the same throne, David's throne, all the way through, even to now and forever. So that's very significant.
All right. With that as a backdrop, why don't we get going into the Arian crisis, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Well, let's see. What was the Arian crisis? One of the most important things to realize about it is that it happened. Well, who was Arius is a good place to start. Arius was a presbyter, a priest of the Diocese of Alexandria, and that he went a little funny in the head over the idea of the Trinity. The Trinity, keep in mind, had not been defined in those terms. In other words, all of that great work of working out all the formulas, fully holy God and holy man, one God in three persons, neither confounding the persons nor dividing the substance. None of that work had been done yet. A lot of it was occasioned by the Arian crisis. But even the primitive early church taught that Jesus is God, his Father is God, and yet there are not two gods. The two converse with each other. They have love for each other. It's not simply the same person wearing two different hats, if you see what I'm saying. And so that's there from the beginning. All the formulas are yet to be worked out. But the particular version that Arius went nutty on was the idea of how do I save monotheism? If Christ is God and his Father is God, how are there not two gods? And it's not as, and before we judge him harshly, which you can for a lot of things, but it's not easy. It's not, you can't just say, I know the answer to the Trinity. Well, all the raw materials for the dogma of the Trinity are all in Scripture, and they were there in the early church. But how exactly that works out? You often hear people say that the Arians denied the divinity of Christ. That isn't quite right. They just fell over themselves trying to multiply honorifics for Christ. He's the creator of the world. He's the, he's all knowing, all powerful, all the rest of it. The one single divine attribute that they wanted to fudge was they wanted to deny the Catholic truth of the eternal co-divinity of the Son with his Father. In fact, the easiest way to understand this is to bring forward Arius's favorite slogan or catchphrase. He even had it set to music for popular use. There was a time when the Son was not. In other words, he said that just the very names Father and Son imply that one of them came first and the other one was subsequent. And therefore, Christ, with all of his attributes, was more of a Xerox copy of God than he was the original co-eternal God. So this may sound like splitting hairs, but what it actually did was allow the churches and the government, the Roman government, to create a kind of Christianity light, which would pave the way and ease the transition for any pagans who have not enjoyed Constantine's sponsorship of Christianity after his conversion. Constantine did not create any of these formulas, as you pointed out. He was not involved in any of that, but he did after his conversion. He didn't even make Christianity the official religion of the empire. You hear that over and over again. It isn't true. It didn't happen until 50 years after his death. But he did sponsor it, and he did try to make up for the persecutions, the great persecutions that the Romans had done over the last 200 years. And he sponsored churches. He gave the money to have new Bibles printed up to replace the ones that had been burned during the great persecution. And so he was actively sponsoring Christianity because he thought that it would be good for the empire, that it was a better religion than the old moribund paganism. So the result of all of that was, though, that about 50% of his empire was willingly ready to become Christian. In fact, the process had already started. By the time Constantine came along, probably a fifth or even a quarter of the Roman Empire had already become Christian. So another myth of the great apostasy, the idea that Constantine made Christianity advantageous to people, and therefore that a lot of people flocked in without actually being converted, just accepted baptism, going along to get along, if you see what I'm saying. In many ways, Constantine jumped on the bandwagon because Christianity was by far the liveliest and most healthful thing in the empire during those declining days. So, but there was the problem of the reluctant. There were people who, as there always are, people who just couldn't see their way, and there were probably about half of the Roman Empire at this point were people who probably would have preferred to stick with the old paganism. Not that they necessarily had any belief in the old gods anymore, but they didn't like change, or it was good enough for my grandpa, it's good enough for me, that sort of thing that you're always going to encounter. So political unrest was definitely possible. In fact, there was a danger that when Constantine died, he'd be replaced by somebody who wanted to treat what he had done as an anomaly, as a kind of an episode. So that, and many people probably thought that would be the case. There had been emperors who had a kind of a personal hobby horse before this. So there was a genuine fear that if this project of Christianizing the empire wasn't completed, that it might bring back the bad old days at some point, that a pagan emperor would come back again and restore the ancient age-old paganism of Rome. So there were a lot of Christians who wanted to help make things easier for Constantine, if you see what I'm saying, make the transition easier. And Arianism became the bottle that they put that in. Arianism by its very nature suggests that there's more than one God, even though they denied it. It also allowed pagans to use thought forms that they were familiar with, that you could worship Jesus as a God rather than the God. And that there was just more wiggle room in it for allowing half-hearted or recalcitrant people to sign on to the program without being wrenched too far out of their ordinary thought forms, if you see what I'm saying. So there began to be pressure both without the church and within the church, but especially within the church, of bishops who, and priests and lay people, who, whether for reasons of cowardice, that they're just afraid of the persecuting pagans getting back in charge again, or whether some of them may have been sincere. Many people know Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote the famous church history, the earliest and most famous church history that even most evangelicals are familiar with, was actually a kind of a soft Arian. He was a guy who was willing to compromise on some of these things and say, well, it's a deep mystery. Who can really know? So let's make room for everybody. So there were Christians within many Christians who began to cooperate, some wholeheartedly and some with reservations, in the project of mainstreaming Arianism, getting it accepted by the bishops, getting it accepted at court, and thus making this transition happen safer and easier without putting too big of a burden on the pagan population. So that was the driving force behind it. It was a desire to complete the religious revolution without causing it to short circuit and blow up.
So basically, they did this through compromise, and I'd almost like a lot of these stories you hear in history, kind of echo to what we have today. A lot of even bishops and priests today want to compromise the faith. They want to water it down. They want to reach out to people in a way that's not the right way to go about it. Every time we water things down and compromise, it just doesn't go well. And I feel like maybe they had good intentions, but it wasn't the right way to go about it. And so, and then how did it end up going after that? Did it end up blowing up? Did the church get involved? The Council of Nicaea put their foot down. Nobody was confused on the matter. It was dogmatic. So how did he squeak his teachings back in? How did it start to pick up steam again?
It's a little bit complicated. Again, we hear a lot of talk about the fact that democracy is fragile and that democracy can fail at any time. And I'll simply say that democracy is one of the most powerful forces in the world. The trouble for our founding fathers was not how to get a democracy, but how to keep from getting too much democracy, because democracies had always failed in the past. But the power of democracy, the power of public opinion, is well nigh omnipotent in human affairs. And just gradually over a period of 30 or 40 years, the rest of Constantine's life, Constantine himself never compromised on Arianism, or at least never became Arian. The minute he died, his son Constantius became his successor, and Constantius immediately began to actively sponsor Arianism and immediately began to actively persecute Orthodoxy. And so he saw very clear the advantages of Arianism to the empire, and having no particular belief himself, he did what he thought was expedient for him politically. And as a result, that process of more and more church leaders accommodating their Arian tinged laity became more and more and more and more, until finally the government got confused and started saying, well, in given the fact that you guys don't seem to know what you think about this, we'll cast our ballot in favor of the one that suits our goals, our this worldly goals, better than the other one does.
So all of the bishops stood up against the emperor, right?
I wish it were as simple as that. I wish I could say that was true. No, actually, by the time of Constantius, after he had had a decade or so to persecute, most of the bishops, at least in the Eastern Empire, I haven't brought in that geographical division yet, but the Western Empire, Western Europe, as odd as this may seem to people who haven't heard this before or are familiar with it, was in a state of decay by this point, by 325. The West had been besieged by barbarian invasions and was in a kind of a Mad Max kind of condition. The streets of Rome had weeds growing out of them, and the public waterworks didn't work anymore. And, it was in a decayed condition. And the east of the Roman Empire, centered around Byzantium, had become much the most important and powerful and wealthy part of the church, of the empire, and also of the church. It was just, this was where things were in order and working well, and the old Rome was decaying, which is the reason that Constantine moved the government from the old city on the Tiber to the new city, New Rome, which eventually became called Constantinople. So the East was where Arianism ran rampant. In the Eastern Roman Empire, it's guessed that good historians have said that at least 8 out of 10 Catholic sees were occupied by Arians by about the year 350.
So heretics.
Yes, the Christological heretics. That's right.
And I only put it that way just so people can see the magnanimous amount of people who were in heresy in the church at the time. People think, oh, we have some bad bishops today. Yeah, but have you ever seen the Arian crisis? I mean, I think it was, I read the 6-volume work by Warren Carroll, and I love the way he paints the whole picture is amazing. He was like, you could count the amount of good bishops on one hand. Like, it's amazing.
Well, that's one of the fathers says that the number of sees that were still in Orthodox hands at that point in the East could be counted on one hand. I think Athanasius himself said that, I think. So it's a hell of a mess, And now it is really important to notice, without pounding a drum against our Eastern Orthodox brethren, that this crisis was almost entirely a crisis of the East, of the populous, urban, prosperous East. The Rome, old Rome, which was in a decayed condition materially, was spiritually in a much better place, and the not just the laity, but also the clergy in the Western European part of the Roman Empire were thoroughly Orthodox all through the crisis. The Arianism never affected Western Europe to any appreciable degree. Whereas in the East, it ran rampant. And that has something to do with the nature of the appeal of Arianism. It was appealing to well-to-do, prosperous people who had a real stake in this world. You see what I'm saying? It was all about making the church help you to keep the lifestyle to which you have become accustomed, both clergy and laity. Although I will say that even in the East, the laity never became wholly Arian. In fact, they held out much, much better. Probably a majority of the laity in the East saw the thing for what it was and had held out against it. It probably, I'm guessing, but 60% probably of the laity were untouched by the crisis, even after their clergy had apostatized. And that was that's something to hang your hat on.
Yeah, maybe you could talk briefly about some of the heroes and some of the villains, the really traitorous, bishops during this time.
Well, the leader of the movement after Arius died right after the council. He's a minor figure in the story, really. And in a way, he seems to have been a sincere crank. He seems to have been a theological guy who just allowed his cart to run ahead of the horse, And but he died apparently believing that he was right. Not long after the council. But the man who took up Arianism, the movement, the small nascent movement, and one of the guys that was actually condemned at First Nicaea was the Bishop of Nicomedia, which was the city that was the location of the imperial palace in the east. Constantinople not being established well enough at this time. The emperor's palace was at Nicomedia. So by nature, the bishop of that city is going to be political, influenced by politics. And he was. His name was Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he really is the chief heresiarch in all of this. But Arius, again, was gone. He was the man who saw the advantages for peace for the church. Peace meaning the avoiding of trouble with the authorities, the avoiding of causing a recurrence of paganism and all the rest of it. And his it's
ironic.
His settled policy was to get Arianism accepted within the church. He didn't insist that it become the new orthodoxy. He just wanted it to be accepted as a legitimate opinion within the church. And since obviously so many people are divided about this, and since it's an inherently deep subject, there ought to be room for people to be Arians, which sounds reasonable until you realize that what he's saying is there ought to be room for the same church to worship two different Jesuses. And then, of course, you see that the whole thing falls apart. It's not nitpicking or niggling, And Athanasius saw this all the way. You asked about villains and heroes. Well, Eusebius of Nicomedia was one of the great villains, probably the most important.
Is he one of the ones who kind of got the emperor on his side and the person? Yes. See, I find this whole thing ironic because he wanted peace in the empire. He didn't want persecutions from the emperor, but then he became the outlet of persecutions against the Orthodox.
Exactly right. Well, that was in-house. That was church discipline. So ironic as that sounds in his eyes anyway. So, but yes, he began using this worldly methods, and how actually the leaders of Arianism in the East got as bad as the pagans had been for forcing lay people, Orthodox lay people, to receive communion from Arian bishops. One of the ways that the Orthodox had resisted what was happening was they just wouldn't accept the sacraments from an Arian bishop. It's not a denial that they still were bishops. The teaching of the church has always been that a validly ordained priest or bishop can confect the sacraments. They don't depend on his own virtue or even his own orthodoxy or belief at all. But nevertheless, this was their way of protesting. I think I'll go down the street to the other church where there's an Orthodox minister. That's not really, that kind of church hopping is not really a good thing in healthy times. but in extraordinary circumstances, there's, you know, this was one of the ways that the laity pushed back against what was being done to them. So, but there was terrible stuff. You know, they got to where they would gather people up and force them to accept communion from an Arian minister. I mean, literally, they had some sort of mechanical device that would cause them to have to open their mouths, and then they stuffed the sacrament into their mouths, and just real and torture and stuff also to get people to go to church where they were supposed to. So,
can you talk just briefly about the persecutions that did occur against those who held out? I mean, you may have more villains you want to talk about as well, but I think people need to know about the intensity and the depth that this went to, and how attacked the Orthodox people were from heretics and from people they got on their side, governments and such.
Right. It really, in some ways, was the greatest crisis of the first millennium. And it was, again, not just because that heresy was so widespread in the East, but that the willingness of these not really Christian people at all. I'm not saying their baptisms weren't valid or anything like that, but many of them were political operators. They simply were pursuing a political goal. And some of them, by the later stages of the crisis, had been appointed by Constantius, Constantine's son, Arian son, fully out and out Arian son. Constantius was picking bishops by this point, so and getting them ordained, which was
okay by church law, right?
Well, anybody can nominate a bishop. You and I could do it. We could send a letter to Rome saying we have a preference as to who our next bishop should be. There's nothing wrong with nominating a bishop. And one of the earliest church documents, the Didache, says, writing to the laity, says, choose for yourself bishops. Some people have said, well, that shows that that bishops weren't chosen by other clergy. They were chosen by the people. Sort of. It says the people nominated a bishop, but even at that early date when the Didache was written, it was an article of faith that a man didn't become a bishop until he was laid hands on by the other bishops. So you could nominate a bishop, but you couldn't insist and force the other bishops to accept your choice. In this case, the emperor was the one doing the nominating. He sent his letter to the eastern bishops, and some of them were enthusiastically compliant. Some of them were just compliant to go along and keep their place, not lose their job. And some were compliant because of fear. There was actual persecution of recalcitrant clergy, which we'll get to, I think, in a minute. But so that's how that happened. You began every day to have a more and more Arian bishopric in the East, and it happened because the emperor took a hand in choosing which version of Christianity he thought was better for the empire. But the heroes, Athanasius above all, diminutive little monk who some scholars believe was carried away as an infant to save him from the great persecution. Because of he was made the Bishop of Alexandria, but he was driven into exile 4 times, maybe 5, 4 times driven out into exile because they were going to kill him at his church. His constancy, the myth says that Constantine defined what orthodoxy was, but Athanasius brought his out in the desert. The most sincere, the most sold out Christians of his day were the people who had fled from the wrath to come, the monks who had gone out into the wilderness during the persecution to keep the faith alive, to keep all the Bibles from being burned and all the rest of it. And so the idea that there was some sort of theological novelty in the Trinity at Nicaea, the champion of the Trinity at Nicaea was Athanasius, and he brought it out of the desert. He brought it from Anthony, the ascetic, the desert wild man. So that is our proof that the Catholic faith, which corresponds to Athanasius's teaching, long predated Constantine or the Council of Nicaea or anything like that. So the great champion, Athanasius.
Yeah,
But
he
we
was
can
wonderful.
also,
He was always a thorn in the side of the Arians. He was always, striking them down with theological blows, and they couldn't stop him. They couldn't beat him, so they just tried to kill him.
right?
He
They
had
did,
continually
yeah.
he had ran away so many times.
Right.
Um,
On one of his trips. Now this is an interesting and an important point. Sometimes you hear people say, well, I'm going to hold out for such and such a priest who has, stood fast for orthodoxy against the modernists. And, even now he's split. He's on the outs with the Pope or whatever. I'm going to stand with him because he's standing up for orthodoxy. He won't compromise. And he, even if all of the clergy and all of the bishops, all of the popes and everything condemn him, I'm standing up for Father so-and-so. That sounds very heroic, but in reality, that's Protestantism. In other words, we define Protestantism as sincere, non-compromising Christians who are on the outs with the Pope. In other words, if you formally break with the Pope, okay, that is the moment where you cease to be Catholic. No matter how many rosaries you say or novenas you pray or whatever, you have ceased to become Catholic when you formally break with the papacy, with the Pope. Okay. And what's encouraging about this story is that the popes were never affected by any of this, except in the sending letters to say, you guys need to knock it off in the name of St. Peter. You guys need to knock this crap off. And their flock stayed Orthodox, and the popes themselves were champions rather than compromisers, with some exceptions I'll talk about in a second. But Athanasius, in one of his exiles, went to Europe, Western Europe. He went to France, and to what is now Germany, to the Black Forest of Germany. So, and hid out there for a while. And then he went to Rome and was the host of Pope Julius, Julius I, who kept him safe and protected him and allowed him to preach to his own congregations and clergy. This, little Oriental dwarf preaching to the bishops of France and Germany and the rest. So, but Julius championed Athanasius. He wrote back to he looked at the condemnations that the Eastern bishops, they had brought out a lot of trumped up charges against him and actually condemned him for stealing a golden chalice out of the church and all kinds of absurd stuff. And one of their councils that was called by, thoroughly Arian clergy said he was guilty. The vote was taken and he was guilty. No surprise. So the Pope in the West reviewed everything with an unbiased jury of clergy, Western clergy, and said, there's nothing in this. So he sent a letter back saying, as the successor of Peter, I'm telling you, you need to restore Athanasius. You've done him an injustice. And of course, they blew him off. But the interesting thing about that, though, is that the popes maintained their orthodoxy through all of this.
Before we finish up, could you talk about the extent, briefly, the extent of the persecutions, how many people were tortured and killed, and they really tried to wipe out orthodoxy. And I don't think people understand how bad it got.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody kept official numbers. It's many thousands. It was, there were roundups in the streets where they brought people out and told them, sign on to this article or we'll have your head off right here. There was many thousands. Again, no statistics,
And many Catholics compromised to save their own soul, right? Including clergy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing was terrible, and done in the name of and by the actions of Catholic bishops. And I don't mean Catholic in their faith, but they were holding a Catholic see. Okay, that was the whole problem. They were holding a position of trust in the Catholic Church, and they were not living up to it. Okay, so that's the sense in which all of this was done by Catholics. We can let ourselves off the hook a little bit and say, well, they weren't Catholics, they were Arians. Their theology was Arians, but they were bad Catholics. Okay, and all heretics are bad Catholics, really. Martin Luther and the others were priests, and teachers in the Catholic religion. So, so the bad Catholics here adopted Arianism and persecuted their brethren, and that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, I remember reading that too in the 6 volume set by Warren H. Carroll. He made it sound like the whole Eastern Church was pretty much eclipsed, and like, how are we gonna get that back on track? And then he talks about how Athanasius and Augustine and some of the rocks in the West just smashed down Arianism. But Arianism lasted for what, 75 years or
longer? If there's an important sense in which Arianism eventually became Islam.
And also in the Jehovah's Witnesses as well, and some other cults today that don't accept the divinity of Christ. It's amazing. It goes back that far, and it's had that such of an influence in the church that some of the heresies we still have today are based on that. And I just want to kind of leave our audience with, the fact that this was so deep, and the book goes into so much more detail. It's called Bad Shepherds by Rod Bennett. Now you can find it on his website or on Amazon. And it just goes into deep detail about the betrayal of many Catholic bishops who resisted for a little while, but then broke, or resisted for a longer, but then broke. But not only broke, many of them ended up turning on their own brethren and persecuting them and torturing them and putting them in jail, exiling them, and just trying to do everything they can to stomp out orthodoxy, which is ironic since their whole goal in the beginning was to protect orthodoxy from the empire and taking over. And they became the empire and kind of took over. But, the many issues we have in the church today, there is modernism. There are clergy teaching heresy. There are clergy trying to push, gay rights and different things like that. And, there's a whole possible schism in the church in Germany. There are a lot of bad things going on today, but to the magnanimous amount that not even remotely close to what was happening back then, and not to the degree either, back in the Arian crisis was huge. Many people never thought the church would recover. Many people never thought the church could get it, solved out. But there were so many heroes that we just don't have time to talk about, who stayed strong, who didn't break, who refused to compromise. And that's the part that I like, that even during the dark times, there were so many heroes who refused to break. And I want to challenge, as somebody who is a nobody before God and a nobody before the church, I just want to challenge any priests out there and any bishops out there who might be watching to not compromise. You might, because today I see it. Good priests get persecuted and bad priests get nothing. Because why? The bad priests have power. The bad priests have influence. The bad priests have sway. If you even correct them, you're going to pay for it. Yes, of course. You're going to pay for it. And many people are like, oh, well, I don't really want to deal with that because that's going to open up a whole can of worms that I don't feel like dealing with. But we're going to discipline good priests, and it's like some of my friends have been disciplined for disciplining bad priests. And I'm just saying there's a little bit of confusion here or there, but I want to challenge everybody to step up and do what's right, even if it's hard, even if you're standing alone. We need to be praying. We need to be fasting. We need to do what's right in times of crisis. Peter Kreeft once rightly said that the problem is not heretics. The problem is not Islam. He said the problem is not Washington, the president, liberals or modernists. He said the problem is twofold: the devil and sin. Those are the problems. Everyone else is a casualty of those problems. And he said the solution is not what you think either. It's not just good people. He said the solution is saints. Saints, people like John Paul II or Padre Pio, Athanasius, Augustine. He said saints change millions of lives. One saint could change 1,000 lives. He say, if we have holy people who are living like the Desert Fathers, living like Athanasius, living like Augustine, we will change the world despite the other people out there. So I want to challenge us to grow holy, to get serious about the faith. Whining and crying about the church, slandering the Pope, slandering all the bad bishops, just yelling and getting angry and bitter does not work. That's what Luther did, and it led him down a bad path. Tertullian, Hippolytus, many other people who got frustrated with people in the church went down that path. But people who were holy, like St. Francis de Sales, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, they were so holy. They faced the same problems, but they conquered them because of their holy lives. And that is, I want to do a whole show just on that. But
you go. Yeah, no, believe it was St. James who said the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. And if we respond in anger, we're not responding in a Christ-like way. Now you might think, you sometimes hear Christ turned over the money changers, tables and all the rest of it. Yes, the judge of humanity gets to judge. Okay, Jesus will judge everybody in the end, and he condemns some of them. So he gets to judge. We can't say Jesus did it, I can do it too. He's the judge and I'm not. So,
well, I might point out that he did it just once, and he also died for the people he did it for. So unless you're willing to die for them,
maybe twice, he might have done it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But I think people use that as a constant excuse. So, I'm just going to go flip all the tables everywhere. No, it's like
James again says, "Who are you, man, to judge your brother?" So yes, Christ, the judge of humanity, gets to judge. For the rest of us, James's counsel is the one to take. So, but yes, do all of your, I forget which saint it was who said, you've got somebody you can fix right at hand. That's you. Okay. You start working on yourself. You fixed one part of the Catholic Church, and you can fix it to the greatest degree that you can. Okay. Everybody else, you might try to have some influence on. Okay. But you have unlimited, scope for fixing the one person. Okay. And when you do it, you fix part of the Catholic Church.
And that's so true. I just told my conversion story. I just posted my conversion story yesterday, I think. And I didn't talk about this part of the conversion, but after my conversion, I wanted to just tell everyone they're wrong, how they have to fix everything. And I was a little wild in my presentation. Someone came up to me and said that, hey, Bryan, if you want to change the world, you first need to change yourself. Because the more you change yourself and purify yourself, the more Christ's light can shine through you, and you won't be such a dirty window. And I was a little offended by that at first, but it's so true. I went and worked on myself. I was like, well, I want to change the world, so I'm going to go really work on myself. But I became more loving, more peaceful, more patient. And the impact I had on people was infinitely more.
There you go. That's it. That's the spirit.
Amen.
Well, it's been fun.
It has, and I've kept you long enough. And we only did one chapter. I mean, I want to recommend your book to people again. It's called Bad Shepherds, and it's called The Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived While Bishops Did the Devil's Work. So even today, Pope John Paul II said that this is the age of the laity. So we are called to be holy. We aren't called to be critics. We're called to be holy people. We're called to rise up. We're called to be what we want them to be. If they're supposed to be holy and saints, but they're not, well, let us be in their place. Right. And I want to thank you for coming on and shedding some of the light of the dark times in the church, but also some of the heroic moments in the church. Some of the darkest times have also inspired some of the greatest heroes.
Well, that's the thing to carry away. Dire as the Arian crisis was, dire as things got during the Dark Ages, dire as they were during the French Revolution, during the Reformation, and all the rest of it. Those things are all ancient history now. The church did survive. We wouldn't be here talking about it if it had failed during those very, very grave crises that make ours look a little bit manageable. So if that's the message that people carry away from the book, I'll be happy.
Amen. And I want to challenge everyone to get it. I will link it down below in the description section. So I want to thank you all for tuning in today and for watching this. Please share it with others so they can know the truth that will set them free. And say a prayer for us as we're always praying for you. God bless you all.